Your book also addresses some of the traditional arguments on women ordination. I was kind of curious, like the historical or traditional approach that you take, or positions that are out there.
Well, that's one of those interesting things that when you actually look at the tradition, you find that there's a good deal of amnesia, as I put it in the book. Somewhere around the mid-20th century, around the 1950s and 60s, as the culture began shifting, there was a theological shift in all the denominations as well. And the denominations that don't ordain women, Roman Catholic complementarians, insist emphatically, we do not in any way, shape, or form question the equality of women or the mutual intelligence of women. We just believe on theological grounds that God does not call women to this position. And one of the reasons why we point that out is that it's never happened historically. The tradition of the church has said no. But what's interesting is that when you actually look at the history of the tradition and find out why is it that the church did not ordain women, you find from the very beginning that the only word to use to describe it is that there's a kind of a sexist bias. And specifically, there are three things that are said about women. Women are said to be less intelligent than men. They're overly emotional, and they're overly subject to temptation, and particularly sexual temptation. And these are grounds, when you read the church fathers and when you read medieval theologians, grounds not simply to not ordain women, but to not allow them to have any positions of leadership whatsoever. So the traditional argument against the ordination of women is not, well, women can do anything except for they can't be ordained. The argument was women shouldn't be doing anything that would involve any kind of position of leadership. John Chrysostom actually, he has this discussion where he says that God created men to be smarter and to run things, and he created women. They're good at managing households, but they should just stick there. And those are the traditional historical divisions in pre-modern industrial culture. In cultures where most work was done using animal labor, the kinds of things that we think, and there was no machinery, women tended to be confined to the home. In pre-industrial cultures, large families are necessary. But if you're confined to the home, you don't tend to be educated. Women in traditional cultures, most people were not educated in traditional cultures. A small handful would have been literate. But anyway, for that reason, the traditional argument that you will find among the church fathers, both East and West, in the medieval period, Thomas Aquinas is actually fairly broad-minded about these things, but he also says the main reason women can't be ordained is because men have a greater power of rationality. He talks about that. And Richard Hooker in the Church of England in his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, when he talks about marriage, he says that women always needed to be guided by women, so for example, when in the marriage ceremony, the reason why the where the father of the bride gives the bride away, it's because the imbecility, that's the actual word that he used, the imbecility of women shows that women have to always be guided by others. So that's the historical argument. And you don't find that argument being used by those opposed to women's ordination these days, and I think that's good. But I think at the same time, if you're simply going to appeal to the tradition, you need to be honest enough to recognize, well, the tradition did look at Scripture, but it provided a theological reason for what they interpreted Scripture to be saying, which was that, women just are not mentally capable of leading. And that's not the argument that would be used today.
Man, like hearing that, and then also just thinking about some of the passages that Paul wrote about women being silent and needing to be submitting to their husbands, like all of that, with especially the historical arguments. If I was a woman, I would just be very hesitant to want to be part of a church that taught that way, because of those, like, that's horrific. Like that type of thinking, that women aren't smart enough, not logical enough, too emotional. Like those are terrible reasons. Like as you're like sharing kind of this traditional viewpoint, and as you chat with women pastors and priests, what do they say about these like terrible historical arguments?
Well, they're not fond of them, that's for certain.
Yeah.
But I think for the most part that I don't think that. Well, one needs to be careful here. I think among feminist theologians, the movement of feminist theology in the church since the 1980s have done research in this area and are familiar with this material. I think sometimes that has been unfortunate among certain kinds of feminist theologians, that they've simply presumed that the church is oppressive to women. But when women discover this, it doesn't make, it certainly doesn't make them happy. It can sort of, fulfill certain suspicions and stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I do think it's fortunate that is not the argument that's being used today, even among complementarians. But I do think that it needs to be pointed out that, okay, if that's not your argument, then you need a theological argument, more than just simply, well, men are in charge. Well, why should men be in charge if women are not somehow less intelligent than men? I think it also is the case, and this keeps coming out more and more, that whatever people say publicly, you do find out that behind closed doors, there's still a lot of sexism in the church and a lot of abuse in the church. There was a case a few weeks ago, or a couple of months ago, in a Facebook group run by some conservative Presbyterians. You may have heard about this, that a woman in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church had just written a book, not about women's ordination, but questioning some of the aspects of complementarianism. And apparently within this group that there was all kinds of sexist comments about women. They should be, the whole kind of barefoot pregnant kind of arguments. And Christianity Today ran an article about this a few months ago.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado Podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.